What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here, and in today's video about populations, we are going to focus in on the growing human population and take a look at how the growth of our population affects the environment, as well as our ability to obtain the resources we need to live our lives. Let's start in the year 10,000 BCE, which means before the Common Era. This is the point in human history where humans began to settle down, grow crops, raise livestock, and build civilizations. Different parts of the human population made the switch away from hunting and gathering at different times, but our best anthropological evidence suggests that it happened for the first time about 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Our best evidence also suggests that at this time, the human population numbered about 5 million people total. By the year 1 CE, our population had grown to about 250 million people. But it wasn't until 1804, only 210 years ago, that the human population hit 1 billion. So it took pretty much all of human history to reach a population of 1 billion, and since then, we've added more than 6 billion additional people to our population. We reached 2 billion in 1927, doubled to 4 billion in 1974. We hit 6 billion back in 1999 when I was still in high school, and we hit 7 billion in the year 2012. By the year 2050, population experts predict that the human population will be over 9 billion people. As you can see in this graph, this pattern indicates exponential growth, just like the bacteria in a jar that we used as an example in our last video. You might also remember that we ended our last video with this question about whether or not humans have a carrying capacity, and if we do, what might that be? That's an important question because if we do have a carrying capacity, or a maximum population size that our environment, or our planet, can support, then we probably want to make plans for the day when we hit that level, so that we make the transition on our own terms, rather than suffering the means that nature uses to control the size of natural populations. Although the human population behaves in many ways like a single population, different parts of our population are at very different points in their technological and social development. So in many ways, it is just as useful to think of the human population as being made up of numerous subpopulations, and we can use national borders to distinguish between different parts of our population in this way. For example, the human population is unevenly distributed across our planet, and some parts contain far more people than others. China is the most populous country on the planet, followed closely by India, and each of these nations contains about 1.25 billion people. The United States is in a distant third, with only about 300 people living in it. Altogether, this means that roughly 2 out of every 5 people on planet Earth are either from China, India, or the United States, as you can see in this pie chart. And most of these are either from China or India. The human population is also unevenly distributed in density. Some parts of our planet contain human beings living at densities of over 4,500 people per square mile, while other parts of our planet are sparsely inhabited, containing, in some cases, less than 1 person per square mile. As population density grows, competition for space and resources becomes more intense, and it becomes easier to spread disease from one person to another. And we see these density-dependent limiting factors become more intense in human populations, just like they do in populations of deer or wolves. Why don't we just spread out and move into some of those uninhabited areas? Well, unfortunately, many of these uninhabited areas, like the Sahara Desert, the Outback, Siberia, and Greenland, are just not suitable for human life. The environments are too extreme and would not be able to provide adequate resources for large human populations. The human population is also growing at vastly different rates. You can see in this graph, for example, that the populations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America are growing rapidly, as indicated by the fact that these bars are getting taller over time. The population of Europe and North America are growing much slower, as indicated by the fact that these bars are not getting much taller over time. Here's another way to look at it. The vast majority of human population growth is occurring in less developed countries, and very little growth is occurring in more developed countries. So as our population increases from 7 billion to 9 billion over the next few decades, about 99% of that growth will occur in less developed countries. A growing human population consumes increasingly more resources. As we can see in this figure, consumption of raw materials here in the United States has increased dramatically over the last century. Worldwide, demand for energy has also increased dramatically, especially for resources like coal, oil, and natural gas. It is important to note that all three of these energy resources are also non-renewable resources, meaning that they regenerate far slower than we consume them, and as a result, we may well run out of these resources one day. In fact, that may already be starting to happen. As we can see in this figure, the production of oil has been increasing for years, but we've been discovering fewer and fewer new oil wells every year since the 1960s and 70s, which indicates that this resource is becoming increasingly scarce and increasingly difficult to find. How much longer the oil lasts is a topic of great debate. When we look at who is consuming the planet's resources, we find that levels of consumption do not usually match rates of population growth. For example, if we look at consumption of wood products around the world, we find that the United States is by far the highest consumer. China is also a very large consumer of wood products, but China's population is about 4 times larger than that of the United States. The continent of Africa doesn't even register on this figure because their consumption of wood is so low, but countries in Africa are some of the fastest growing countries in the world. A similar trend can be seen in terms of fossil fuel consumption, where the United States is also in first place by a long shot. The average person living in the United States consumes almost 5 times as much fossil fuel as the global average. The average person living in each of the 3 closest countries, Russia, Germany, and Japan, each consume about half as much fossil fuel as the average US citizen, and that is still well above the global average. In countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia, both of which are growing very rapidly, fossil fuel consumption per person is only a tiny fraction of the global average. As our population grows, and as we consume more resources, we also end up producing more waste and pollution, and putting more pressure on our environment as a result. Global climate change, or global warming, is something we've talked about before, and although there is much debate over the whys and hows of global warming in the political sector, scientists around the world overwhelmingly agree that the available evidence indicates that our climate is changing, and it is changing because of excess CO2 in the atmosphere generated by human activities like the burning of fossil fuels. This figure shows us who's putting that CO2 into the atmosphere, and it should be no surprise, based on the last figure we saw, that the United States is one of the top contributors. China is also high on the list, despite the fact that per capita fossil fuel consumption was lower than the global average. But remember, there are about 1.5 billion people living in China, so even though fossil fuel consumption per person is relatively low, they have so many people living there that the total fossil fuel consumption, and therefore total CO2 emissions, are quite high. A changing climate could mean big and not necessarily pleasant changes for humanity as well. A changing climate puts pressure on our environment, and may alter our environment in a way that makes it increasingly difficult for our environment to support our way of life. As the human population grows, we also put pressure on the environment because we convert natural habitats to suit our needs, often making these converted environments far less suitable for natural populations of plants and animals. In these figures, we can see the extent of habitat loss on our planet, and sometimes the numbers are quite striking. For example, in this figure, we can see that in Asia alone, over 800 million hectares of forests, 150 million hectares of grasslands, and 80 million hectares of assorted other ecosystems have been converted due to human activities. That amounts to 44% of the total available land in Asia, converted for humans and lost to natural populations of plants and animals. If we look at this other figure, we can see that between 20 and 70% of most natural biomes worldwide have been lost due to deforestation, with the exception of boreal forests and tundra. We are projected to lose even more by the year 2050. For example, by 2050, we may have lost as much as 65 to 70% of our tropical forests and grasslands. Not only is this a huge loss of natural habitat in some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, but these forests are also important for balancing our climate since they remove CO2 from the atmosphere and may help to offset climate change, which obviously they can't do if we cut them all down. Habitat loss is also one of the major driving forces behind species endangerment, and as more and more habitat is lost, more and more plants and animals may become threatened or endangered or even go extinct. In this figure, we can see that in those countries where consumption of resources and rates of habitat loss are the highest, are also where we find the greatest number of endangered species. Countries like the United States, China, India, and Brazil. Australia is an interesting case because species endangerment in Australia is more likely due to the introduction of non-native species that outcompete the native wildlife. Additionally, Australia has suffered more than many other countries from the initial effects of climate change, seeing some of the worst, longest, and most severe droughts on the planet, droughts often followed by catastrophic wildfires. Then, when the rains finally do come, they cause massive flooding because there's no vegetation to soak it up. It's a little taste of what the rest of the world might be in store for if we let this climate change business get any more out of hand. If we look at fish stocks around the world, which are important food sources for billions of humans, we can see that fully 66%, or 2/3 of all fish stocks in the oceans, qualify as either heavily exploited, overexploited, or depleted. Humans depend on these fish for their survival in many parts of the world, and as our population grows, these stocks will become increasingly important, and at the same time they will be becoming increasingly endangered. So here it is in a nutshell. A growing human population consumes more resources and produces more waste and pollution as a result, and puts more pressure on the environment. And since we depend on the environment to provide us with goods and services that we rely on for our survival, this question about whether or not humans have a carrying capacity becomes increasingly important. So far, our ability to invent new technologies has allowed us to expand our population without restrictions and to keep pushing our carrying capacity up and up and up. But can it really go on like this forever? This is where the study of population demographics can be really useful, which is the study of population structure and how it changes over time. So let's start simple. Say, for example, we have a single population. Maybe it's a population of humans in a single country, or maybe it's a population of turtles in a single pond. Births and the immigration of new individuals into this population both add to the population, while deaths and the emigration of individuals out of this population both subtract from this population. So, if birth and immigration rates are higher than death and emigration rates, our population will grow in size. And if birth and immigration rates are lower than the death and emigration rates, our population will shrink in size. Understanding how things like birth and death rates change in a population over time helps us to understand how that population is likely to change in size over time as well. And understanding how this works for the human population will allow us to make plans for our future, hopefully in a way that allows for our population to thrive on a healthy planet for generations to come. As human populations develop over time, it turns out that there are predictable changes to birth and death rates in particular that occur as a population advances technologically and socially. And we call these predictable changes the demographic transition, in which a population develops from one with high birth and death rates to one with low birth and death rates. Let's take a look at how this demographic transition occurs. We call stage 1 of the demographic transition the pre-industrial stage. These are hunter-gatherer or early agricultural populations, and there really aren't very many groups of humans who fall into this category anymore, with the exception of a few remote groups. These populations are characterized by high birth and high death rates, and as a result, the population doesn't grow very much. We can see in the chart here a description of why that is. Because these populations have very low technological and social development, rates of famine and disease are high, and with relatively little medical knowledge, that means many deaths early in life. Also, societies like this have little concept or need for family planning, so many children are born without necessarily being planned for. Stage 2 of the demographic transition is the early industrial stage, and countries like Egypt, Kenya, and India fall into this category. These kinds of populations also have a high birth rate for the same reasons that pre-industrial populations do. But because they have begun to develop better technology, the death rate begins to fall, and the population begins to increase rapidly as a result. These technological advances include improvements in medicine and sanitation, and improvements to the water supply, and all these work together to make people healthier and less likely to die from injury or disease. In stage 3, or the industrial stage, the death rate continues to fall, and the birth rate begins to fall as well, leading to slower population growth, but still a growing population overall. These are countries like Brazil and China, where fundamental shifts away from agricultural economies towards economies based on manufacturing means that fewer children are required to keep the family farm afloat, so to speak. These populations also have a trend towards living in cities, where population density is much higher and where it can be difficult to find space for large families. In stage 4, or the post-industrial stage, social advances like increased access to birth control and family planning services, increased empowerment for women, and later age of marriage and reproduction mean that birth rates continue to fall as families are making conscious choices to have fewer children and to have them later in life. This, along with continued improvements in medicine and food supply, mean that a country has achieved both a low birth rate and a low death rate, and population growth is likely to level off and remain stable over time. This may lead eventually to a fifth stage in the demographic transition, which is mostly hypothetical at this point, in which population growth actually reverses itself and populations decrease in size over time, due once again to those conscious choices to have fewer children per family and to have them later in life. If those choices lead to a birth rate that's lower than the death rate, then this population will decrease in size, and we're beginning to see that kind of trend in some countries, like Germany and some of the other nations in Europe. The human population probably cannot keep growing forever, and so it may be in our best interest to ask ourselves how we can begin to slow our rate of growth to ensure that we approach our carrying capacity gracefully instead of catastrophically. A few decades ago, China took the approach of making it illegal to have more than one child per family, and the result was not pretty, as many children were abandoned by their families so that the family could try again for whichever gender they preferred. More than that, this one-child policy brought up many great ethical issues, and China was widely criticized by the global community for enacting laws that infringe on basic human rights. As it turns out, one of the best ways to lower the birth rate is through education, in particular the education of women. Data indicates that when women are empowered to go to school and are given the same rights as men, fertility rates drop, and women choose to have fewer children. In Ethiopia, where female secondary school enrollment is less than 10%, each woman has, on average, between 6 and 7 children. In South Africa, where female secondary school enrollment is up around 95%, each woman has, on average, only 3 children. Here in the United States, the average is just over 2 children per woman of reproductive age. Education leads to better decision making, and this leads to fewer children being born overall. So when we ask ourselves how to control our growing population, education may just be the answer. As a population proceeds through the demographic transition, there are fundamental changes that occur to the structure or demographics of that population. These graphs we see at the bottom of the screen are called population pyramids, and each one is basically a histogram that tells us how many males and females in each age range are living in a population. The wider the bar, the more individuals there are in that age group. The shape of these pyramids tells us a great deal about where that country is in the demographic transition, as well as how that population is likely to change in size over time. For example, this triangular shape, in which there are far more people in the younger age groups, tells us that this population is growing rapidly, because every year there are more children born than in the year before, which is why the bottom of the pyramid flares out the way it does. This is characteristic of less technologically and socially developed nations, pre-industrial nations that are growing fast due to a lack of family planning. Countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and India have populations that look like this. This shape, however, in which a population pyramid has nearly vertical sides, indicates a country further along in the demographic transition. Conscious choices to have fewer children, choices made possible by access to birth control and family planning services, empowerment of women, and greater quality of education, mean that the base of our population pyramid will grow narrower, and the population growth will slow or even stop as a result. A population pyramid shaped like this, where the base of the pyramid actually gets narrower than the middle of the pyramid, indicates that this population is decreasing in size, as each successive generation has fewer children than the generation before. We would see far more one-child or no-child families in a population like this, and it happens not because of disease or shortages of resources or environmental catastrophes, but because people chose for this to happen. And this is a far more attractive option than growing to the point where our environment can no longer support us and our numbers start to drop due to famine and disease. So just to review, a high percentage of individuals in a young age group indicates high rates of reproduction and rapid population growth. So in terms of overall population growth, we would predict that Madagascar's population is growing at a much faster rate than that of the United States based on the demographics of each population. A high percentage of individuals in older age groups indicates an aging, shrinking population. Based on recent trends in China, who has eased up considerably on the one-child policy, by the way, We might predict that something like this will happen to the Chinese population over the next few decades as they begin to transition from the industrial stage to the post-industrial stage and beyond. So getting back to our big picture about how the growing human population affects the planet and its many ecosystems, it's important for us to remember that it is not necessarily the fastest growing nations that are having the largest impact. Human impact on the environment is based not only on the size of a population, but also on its level of affluence and technology, and this IPAT equation helps us to summarize this relationship. For example, countries like the US, which is growing at a rate of about 1% per year, which is still exponential growth by the way, have very high levels of affluence and technology, meaning that we can afford to consume a great deal of resources, and our technology allows us to do that in a way that is very efficient, so our overall impact on the environment is very high. Countries like Madagascar, which is growing at a rate of over 3% annually, much faster than the United States, have far less affluence and technology, so they consume far fewer resources on average and have a far lower impact on the environment as a result. Which is why, if we look at this map again, Madagascar is so tiny and green, and the US is so bloated and red. Our consumption and impact on the environment per person is far greater. But think back to the demographic transition. What happens to a nation's level of affluence and technology as they progress through the demographic transition? On this map, China is roughly the same size as the US, meaning that overall, the nation of China consumes as many resources as we do here in the United States. But there are 4 times as many people living in China, which means that on average, each person in China consumes 1/4 of the resources that the average US citizen consumes. That's why China isn't red on this map, but is more towards the beige end of the spectrum, because each person consumes fewer resources. But what happens if China progresses all the way through the demographic transition, increasing in affluence and technology until they reach the point where each person living in China consumes as many resources as each person living in the United States? What if every country on the planet eventually reaches that point? Could our planet really support 9 billion people, each of us living the US lifestyle and consuming resources at the same rate we do here in the United States? Almost certainly not, and people who study this kind of thing estimate that it would take something like 5 planet Earths to support the 7 billion people we have now if they all consumed resources like we do here in the USA, and even more planets if we're going to support 9 billion people by the year 2050. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a lot of difficult decisions to make about how to support all those people on only one planet Earth. Needless to say, we have our work cut out for us. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully you understand the human population a little better, as well as the causes and consequences of unrestricted population growth in the human population. Remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need to until you feel like you understand the concepts. And with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.